Hey, time out. Why does it feel like churches only care about my money? Well, Dave, that's a fair question, and we should talk about it right now on Overtime. Hey everyone, my name is Josh. Welcome to Overtime, a series of videos where we look at some of the most popular comments in the comment section on our Time Out series, and we do a deep dive to unpack the discussion a bit more and have some dialogue. Now, a popular criticism of Christianity comes from folks who claim that the church is primarily interested in getting one's cash. Critics will point to places like the Vatican that control millions, if not billions of dollars when considering all of its assets, or some fringe preacher on the TV who's more interested in his own wealth than the well-being of others. There is much that has been and can be discussed on this topic, so let's jump right in. Do Christian churches make a lot of money? Now, for this conversation, we're going to limit a lot of our discussion to what happens in the average Protestant church in North America. The reason for this is because it's a context with which I'm most familiar, so I'm not going to speak out of turn on things I haven't researched. And there's always going to be extreme ends to whatever bell curve we look at. If we're going to have a more honest conversation, it's important that we do it around what is most regular, meaning what most Christians encounter when giving to their own church and ministries in the North American context. Now, the average giving for adults who attend U.S. Protestant churches is about $17 a week. This is about $2 more than your average movie ticket and about $200 less than the price of admission to a pro football game. Go Steelers. 37% of regular church attendees and evangelicals don't actually give money to church. 17% of American families have reduced the amount that they give to their local church, and 7% of churchgoers have dropped regular giving by 20% or more since 2012. You see, the reality is that most evangelical churches probably aren't run by wealthy hedge fund folks or some people using religion as a get-rich-quick scheme. So the question becomes, why do churches collect money at all? What's the importance of tithing or giving? Well, the answers for this are actually pragmatic and spiritual. Now, it's important to remember that as a non-Christian, if you're watching this, you may think that the following information I'm about to give is stupid. However, you have to know that's totally fine. If you're not a Christian, I'm not going to expect you to agree with each reason I'm about to give, but I challenge you to listen with an open mind and leave a comment if you have any questions or contentions to offer. So let's start with the practical reasons. Ministry in America costs money. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to be buying the most opulent of things. It does mean that it costs money to own land, to pay rent, to keep the lights on, and most importantly, to do ministry, like feeding and clothing those in need. Then on top of this, there are salaries for those who work at the church. Healthcare, things like this. Now, on one level, you can make the argument that people ought to do ministry for free. This is an argument that people do make, and there's definitely merit to it, and we're actually going to talk about that in the next section. It's also worth noting that the average salary of a pastor or church worker is usually about 80% of their peers in other workplaces. For now, suffice it to say that there are a bunch of logistical realities that exist when doing ministry in the 21st century, and as a result of this, there are several pragmatic reasons that deem the collection of money from church-attending people as an important and appropriate thing. As individuals, we pay for things like food, entertainment, and healthcare that we believe benefit us. Now, church isn't designed to be a transactional commodity like the aforementioned. Additionally, Jesus made it very clear that a religious leader should never give favoritism to a person based on their wealth or lack of it, as God's family is meant to be inclusive of all in equal standing regardless of wealth or social status. That being said, there is a practical side to providing for the operational cost of the church, much like we do for hospitals and grocery stores. Just be glad that you don't get a bill at the end of the Sunday service like you do at the checkout line or when you're being discharged from the hospital. When we consider it from a spiritual angle, I think the conversation actually gets more interesting. Now, I do need to admit my bias up front. I am a person who works in ministry professionally, so I have skin in the game here. So as you're listening to my reasonings and justifications, all of which come from Scripture, just know that I am certainly bringing that into the conversation. So first, from a spiritual perspective, I think giving and tithing is critically important because of what power money can have over us in our lives. Jesus says it like this in Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. We need to give regularly as followers of Jesus, because anytime we begin to hold on to our money too tightly, we run the risk of letting something sit in the place of God as the most important thing in our life. This is especially true in America, where for so many of us, our basic needs are met and we have the freedom to think that we can give and take care of ourselves, and we accidentally end up cutting God out of the conversation entirely if we aren't careful. Additionally, I think it's an important thing to point out that we give because Scripture actually commands it. Paul sums this up quite well in the second letter to the Corinthians when he writes, "Each man should give what he has decided in his own heart to give." The conversation here is a question of how much is one going to give, not if they're going to give. Now, people will often say 10% of one's income is what ought to be given. However, we acknowledge 10% comes from the teaching in the Old Testament Testament, and it's often noted that specific percentages are not outlined in the New Testament. So some people, it will be actually more than 10% that they should give, and for some people, it will be less. This is a crucial distinction because it's a reminder that it's all about an issue of the heart. Look at how Jesus has instructed his disciples in Mark 12 when he witnesses a widow give her last 2 mites, or like basically pennies, to the temple, versus the impressively large donations offered publicly by the wealthy members of that same temple. You see, Jesus praised the widow for her faith while not being terribly impressed by the large sums given publicly by the wealthy folks. It's also worth noting here that Jesus didn't actually excuse the widow from giving, but made it clear that God is far more interested in the matters of the hearts and the faith and obedience this woman had that was behind the giving, not how much she actually gave. The key here is that we are working towards cultivating an obedient and generous heart, like the one that God has. This is the ultimate aim, not the specific amount given. Another reason we talk about giving is that so pastors can be paid. Yes, here it is. I think pastors deserve to be paid. In 1 Corinthians 9:9-14, Paul says, "For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel." You see, what's important to remember here is Paul's attitude towards money. It isn't the be-all end-all for him. In fact, Paul was a tent maker so that he wouldn't put an obstacle in the way of the gospel for this church in Corinth. The same is true for many pastors. Many pastors work 2 jobs because the church at which they serve can't afford to pay them a living salary for their work. This is a regular occurrence throughout American churches. And also, I'd argue one of the spiritual reasons for giving is to help you and me, as people, put skin in the game. When we're a part of a church that has a robust plan for how to spend the money towards kingdom good, helping the community, providing opportunities for people to hear about Jesus and things like that, then giving allows us to be part of the mission work that Christ has instructed the church to do, even if we're not the ones that's giving the sermon on Sunday. For some people, their calling is to give so others can go. Each person has a contribution to make to the kingdom. And now finally, Jesus tells us that where our treasures are, our hearts will be also, in Matthew 6. He reminds us to invest in things of heaven that will never wear out or break, unlike the temporary material wealth of this earth. So in conclusion, there are a myriad of reasons that we have talked about here, practically and spiritually, regarding why people ought to be giving. And it starts with, because God said to. When we cultivate a spirit of generosity in our lives as believers, it empowers churches to do what they were called to do, bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. So what do you think? Should churches collect money, or are they just greedy thieves living tax-free on the donations of suckers? Let us know, and until next time, we'll see you in the comments.